I'm going to be talking to you about how I navigated finals in my final year, and also some of the questions you might be worried about if you're going to be good enough, how are the exams, and how difficult actually passing finals is. Going to try to answer all of those questions and tell you exactly how I did it. So I attended medical school at Newcastle University. I was on the old curriculum, which meant my finals were actually my final year, and I didn't know if I had become a doctor until the very last day of medical school, as I still had to sit all of my medical school final exams along with the PSA and the SJT. So my year started off in September, where I started off with specialty rotations first. This meant every 3 weeks I'll be changing a new specialty rotation. At the end of the 3 weeks, I would have a clinical encounter, which would encompass me taking a history, performing an examination, and having about 5 to 6 minutes of questions on either the presentation, investigations, and trying to justify the way I'd done things. Now, my first rotation was general practice. I enjoyed this a lot. Prior to this, we just had the pandemic, and I think I'd finished medical school for 4th year in around end of February. So from end of February till September, I was just casually working, doing past medicine questions, making sure my notes were up to scratch, my management was up to scratch with the guidelines. The only thing I hadn't quite done a lot of was practicing examinations and taking histories. But honestly, I just picked off where I left off at 4th year. The first rotation was very enjoyable. From the get-go, I was doing a lot more than they were expecting me to do. I got to run my own clinics, sometimes parallel with what the GP was. On that aspect, that was very enjoyable. That was good. I felt like everything I'd done in the past couple of years was finally coming together. I kind of felt like I was actually going to become a doctor. It was the first time I actually felt like I was in charge, and I wasn't just being a medical student that was being led by a leash and being told what to do. Other things we got to do was I got to teach other medical students as well, I think in the 3rd year and the 4th year. Yeah, I had the GP clinical encounter. It was heart block. It was quite difficult, I'm not gonna lie. I didn't get the diagnosis, but my differentials were good and I passed. And then for my second rotation, I went into psychiatry. So psychiatry, it's usually the more slower pace of the rotations. It's usually one that you want to probably have last in that sequence, as you have more time to revise. But anyway, the key challenging things I would say, especially in the pandemic, was having to travel to loads of different places in terms of the community psychiatry placements, and also being out on the ward. It was quite tough, as it's hard sometimes to get history from psychiatry patients due to the nature of their presentations. Out of all the clinical encounter exams I did, I would say psychiatry was definitely one of the most difficult due to how specific they want the answers to be in terms of the management, in terms of the investigations. The next rotation after this was women's health. Women's health was one of my favorites, as I'd done the rotation before in my 3rd year. After that, I had peds. But with peds, the challenging thing is the amount of conditions you have to get through, because you've got to do all the adult conditions, and then there's a few add-on ones that only present in peds that you have to know about, and then you have to know the slight variations in management for peds and adults. It can be quite tricky, and I would say in terms of content-wise, peds and GP were the most content-heavy. But my top tips for how I navigated through that, I would try to practice my examinations and my history at least once a week, every single week throughout that whole period. I would do past medicine questions specific to every specialty rotation. There was another book which had 500 medical questions, which I'm going to put onto the screen, which is very useful, and I would also go through the specialty questions in those as well. I would print off those questions, and if I was in clinic and there was nothing to do, I would make sure I was doing those questions. I'd also take my notes as well that I could read during clinic. I would also take my history notes, which I would go through any spare moment I got. So the overall ethos of this, it was 3 weeks per specialty. There's not a lot of time, it's jam-packed. You have to be very efficient. Every single minute in the day when you're traveling, or even when you're on the wards, you're in the hospital doing nothing, it's time for you to revise, as the more you get done during the day, the less you have to do when you go back home. And with this strategy, I managed to be able to work Monday to Friday. Saturdays, I'll probably take Saturday off. Sunday, probably do half a day. And yeah, that's what the structure of my weeks were, and I managed to do that quite comfortably. Moving past the special rotations took us to about December, November time, and around this time was a time where I started thinking about my SJT. I had started doing questions here and there prior in the pandemic because I had extra time, so I thought, why not start? I had a separate video which goes into depth of how I revised for the SJT, which will be in the description below. Decided to take my SJT in December so I would have more time to sync my PSA, which was due in February. I didn't really want to do both of them at the same time, so I thought that would be quite stressful. After this time period, come back in January, my first rotation was medicine. So medicine, I think, was about 8 weeks, so it could have been more. And in terms of medicine, it was quite interesting. I was in A&E, I did neuro. I can't really remember all of the other places I went to, but I remember there was also a couple of night shifts here and there that we had to do, a couple of weekend shifts, and it was all right. Medicine was all right, it was enjoyable. I felt when you went back into main hospital, you were expected to take care of your own learning a bit more, whereas on the special rotations, it was only 3 weeks, it was very structured. It was almost like you're being spoon-fed, but once you're back in hospital, you expected to know what you wanted to do, as we also had these logbooks that we had to get filled out throughout the year. Some of them had GMC competencies, some of them had things that the university was expecting us to get done. You had to organize your time and make yourself be present on the ward at the right time. So for example, I had a placement in the cardiovascular ward where, I could go in when I needed to go in. And some days I think I would go in from like 8 and leave at 6 or 7. Just to make sure I got one thing signed off that was difficult to get signed off. So one of my top tips when it comes to the logbooks is you definitely need to be somebody who's proactive, who's thinking forward. Get it done and out the way as soon as possible, even from day one. Get as much signed off as you can. In terms of revision, I carried on the same revision structure, but this time, whatever themed week I was on, I would try to do extra questions. So for example, if I had cardiovascular week, I'll try to do at least extra questions in my past medicine revision, as well as general questions as well. Because what I wanted to do was to bring it all together. So I would study medicine questions in general and then focus on particular specialties in addition to those questions that I would have for that particular week. So moving on, the other final one was surgery. Surgery was the one which was wishy-washy in terms of, I didn't know, did I need to make a whole completely new different notes compared to the ones I had for medicine, or would it be safe not to make any extra note? I ended up making extra notes using a website called Teach Me Surgery. I'll include the link below. And in terms of surgery, it was mostly going into theatre and there was a lot of anesthetics. It was really interesting. I think you got a lot of experience in terms of interacting with other doctors that were on their job. People were really willing to teach and give you a lot of time. It's once again, if you're proactive, you could really go in. If you wanted to be missing from action, that could happen too. You really need to work out how much clinical time you need to practice your clinical skills, such as taking histories, examinations, and then you also need to work out how much time you need to allocate to you learning the knowledge. Being good at clinical skills without the knowledge to back it up is not going to be useful. Being good at knowledge without clinical skills is not useful. So it's balancing your time, and I would say just utilize your time wisely. If you're going to a ward, definitely take some stuff to do. There's no point you being sat in a clinic and you see the same thing 15 times, and between those patients you're waiting 15-20 minutes and going to Costa to go and get a coffee when you could be using that time to do questions. It will allow you to free up your time. I know we've spoken a bit about studying already. I think my top tips for studying is a little along the way, goes a long way. For me, I will do my 9 to 5, like I said. I will try to study throughout the day. So I had a set allocation of past medicine questions I wanted to do. There was a book of questions with written questions that I wanted to do. I set myself a target of how many pages of my notes I needed to read for that day, and also examinations and histories that I needed to practice. So for me, it was a case of I set my workload for the day. I tried to accomplish as much as I can during that work day when I'm at hospital on placement, and then when I come home, whatever is left would mop up. It usually used to result in me doing an hour to 2 hours extra. I would also set myself time to read books of self-development. Having that kind of approach throughout the year will also mean that on weekends I could take some downtime off or study less. Also, as it came towards the end of the year, I think it was a case of I had a good foundation, I had a good base level, then I could allocate my time to focus on what I needed to go through. So moving on to the other big part of the year is living in accommodation. So for me, I opted to stay at the hospital grounds. Studying medicine is cool, but I don't want medicine to be all of my life. So for me, I found it quite isolating because I was in Middlesbrough. It was the middle of nowhere. Only people I knew were my flatmates. In my downtime, I don't really want to be talking about medicine. I also like to write and record music. That's one of my other passions and hobbies. I'm very into investing, stock, crypto, all of those other things. And for me, I needed to be in an environment which was separate from where I was working for me to be able to relax, to be able to cool down. And that was something that wasn't quite available. So I lived in hospital accommodation from September, and then till about December, I started having ideas of moving. So uni was at Newcastle, placement was in Middlesbrough. And I had the smart idea of moving to Newcastle in February as a birthday present to myself. But what I didn't factor in account to was it was the pandemic. Transportation to Middlesbrough was not very regular. Initially, I used to wake up at about 8 or 7 a.m. in the morning and probably easily start the day at 9. if I was on placement on a specialty rotation, maybe would have to wake up about 6:30 sometimes, not all the time. Now, after I moved to Newcastle, I think I would wake up at 4 a.m. sometimes, 3:30 at the worst, because the train would leave at 6 a.m. or 5:45. And there was no feasible way for me to get onto this train. It's like an hour and a half to 2 hours. Then I would arrive in Middlesbrough, have to wait for about 30 minutes to an hour before the actual day starts. Sometimes I would even stop in the city centre and walk for about an hour just to make sure time passes. And that was tough. Having to wake up that early and not having enough sleep, that was tough. At the end of the day, I'll probably finish in Middlesbrough about 5 or at worst day at 6. Probably get to Newcastle about 7 or 8 p.m. Boy, I was tired. Some of the times I'll just get home, be up for an hour, eat food, shower, do your press-ups, sit-ups, bed. Finish. I would be destroyed. Thinking back, it probably wasn't the wisest decision, but in terms of my mental health, I felt like I needed that. I needed to be away from that environment so that I could process, so that I could function. So I was happy I made that decision and that choice in the end, as you know, it made me a lot happier overall. Once again, like I always say, it's all about utilizing your time and being very wise with it. So I knew I would spend